Hello, welcome to another Paranormal Peep Show with myself, Neil Geddesward, and my fellow presenter, Andrew Chaplin. Andy, how are you?
Yeah, pretty good, Neil, pretty good. The summer is now waning. We've had a very long, hot, warm period in the UK here, so that was pretty good, and had a nice time in a little holiday thing in Gloucester with some friends, hot tub, all that kind of thing. But autumn is rattling on its way. I noticed the Americans have got a bit of an issue with hurricanes, and the Asians have got an issue with typhoons at the moment. So it's that time of year, I think.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I saw a leaf fall on a tree earlier this week, and I thought, that's a sign, isn't it?
The first brown leaf that falls, instantly out come the pumpkins and the pumpkin carving kits.
Yeah, well, we
Halloween,
have seen Halloween stuff in the shops. I was down there today, and I saw, as I mentioned on Facebook to you, I saw Bobby Davro in Weymouth Town. So that's the first sign of autumn, I see, when you first see Bobby Davro.
It is, definitely.
How's your new car going, by the way? Because you bought a new one.
Oh yes, my poor little Hyundai is dying, sadly. It's still just about road legal, but its exhaust is having a little bit of an issue. So I've got a Honda now, Honda Civic, unbelievably 2003, and 0 MOT failures ever. So
wow,
it's been kept in really good condition. It's a bit old, it's a bit retro, but it goes, and I'm quite pleased with it actually.
You see, that's the sort of thing they don't throw away the blueprints for. They improve upon and improve upon and improve on.
No telemetric data is missing on this car.
That's right. They keep a record so they can improve upon these things. And there's one man that does know about cars because he used to sell them of Japanese variety, and that's Mr. Marcus Allen. And regular listeners will know that he joined us last month, and he's back with us for a round two. Marcus Allen, welcome to the Paranormal Peep Show.
Thank you very much. What a nice place to be.
Thank you.
Hello, Marcus. Did I make the right decision? Is a Honda Civic 1.6 litre a good investment, do you think?
It's very good. At the 1.6, I would say we give you 35 plus miles to the gallon.
Mm.
So
anyone listening at the moment and tuning in,
yeah, we're not a car program. We have to point this out. We are not a car program, but it just so happens that Marcus, in a former life, before he became the Nexus distributor of the UK, wonderful magazine Nexus, and the sort of co-publisher of Nexus, he worked in, as he said, Toyota, selling cars. And interestingly, because I had a Toyota Yaris a few years ago, brilliant car as well. So congratulations on your new car, Andy. Now, we'll get to the task in hand then, I suppose, which is obviously we were talking on our last show with Marcus about the Apollo moon missions of the late 1969 through to 72, I believe. They had 6 missions to the moon, I believe. One failed, technically, which was Apollo 13. Now, Marcus has been looking into that for quite a few years now, and he's looked into the side of things of photography and telemetry data and rockets and things like that. So, Marcus, welcome back, and we're going to hopefully get joined later on by a gentleman who works for the Astronomy Roadshow, Peter Bassett. He's going to join us in part 2, and he's kind of like the opposite to you, isn't he? So he's going to be the guy that's going to tell you the official line and how it is. And are you in good shape for this duel with him?
I'm looking forward to it, because if I'm wrong, I want to know I'm wrong so I can correct some erroneous statements I've made. But given that I've been making these statements for 25 years and nobody said, "Oi, Marcus, you're wrong, and this is why," I'm looking forward to it. If somebody can come up with a plausible explanation for how I've completely wrecked the whole concept of Apollo landing on the moon. Oh, by the way, there were 9 missions that went to the moon. Apollo 8 didn't land, Apollo 10 didn't land, and Apollo 13 didn't land for reasons that we may discuss later.
Yes.
There were 6 other missions which did land. So 12 people allegedly are moonwalkers, some of whom have passed on now, but a few are still alive. So there were 24 astronauts sent beyond low Earth orbit, and 3 of the astronauts went twice, which is why the figure isn't 27, because 24 astronauts were sent, 3 actually went twice to the moon. Jim Lovell, he went twice. He didn't land. He was on Apollo 8 and Apollo 13, so he missed out completely. Gene Cernan was on Apollo 10 and Apollo 17, so he did walk on the moon. And John Young was on Apollo, I believe it was 10 and 16. So 3 of them went twice.
Right. So really, they've got double doses of radiation.
They got double doses of radiation, so they should be doubly... No, they weren't. Obviously, it didn't affect them because they had the right stuff.
Now, Marcus, this is before we get onto the photography side of things. This could be going back to the Japanese thing, an interesting segue, actually. Are you aware of the Japanese having any involvement in the Apollo missions, or did they have any plans to go to the moon that you might be aware of that they may have cancelled or put on hold or anything like that?
The only thing I'm aware of is the Japanese Selene, that's Selene, Selene, which is a derivation of the Latin word for moon. Selene orbiter, which the Japanese did launch. I can't remember the exact date. I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago, and which photographed the lunar surface. Was there anything kind of like in the 60s or 70s? Because you'd think that if the Japanese have a reputation for high reliability, they would have some involvement with the space race, or indeed go their own direction and go it alone. I'm not aware of any involvement of any Japanese company within the space program, because don't forget, the space program was basically 1961 to 1975. That's the Apollo missions. And at the time, Japan was they'd had the Olympic Games in 1964, which sort of announced their resurrection from the devastation of World War II. But they weren't involved, to my knowledge, they were not involved in anything to do with the American space program.
And do you think that was because they weren't a superpower and didn't have the budget, or do you think they came to the conclusion that it couldn't be done? Or
I think they weren't asked.
They weren't asked.
Because NASA would approach various companies when they were putting the space program together. They would approach various companies if they had a contribution that NASA felt they could make, which was a better contribution than any American company could make. Hence, they approached Hasselblad for the cameras. They didn't approach Nikon or Canon or Mamiya or any of the other Japanese camera manufacturers. Nikon cameras have been used extensively since then, but at the time, to my knowledge, they were not a major contribution to the space program.
And so far as I'm aware, the Russians basically said we can only land a cosmonaut on the moon if we can guarantee that they'd come back. And so far, they haven't done that.
That's correct. And that statement was made to Bernard Lovell, who was head of the Jodrell Bank Radio Telescope near Manchester, which was at the time tracking or helping the Soviet Union, as it was then, track their spacecraft, because the Soviet Union didn't have the worldwide deep space network that NASA had deployed to track their craft. So they approached Bernard Lovell to help them, which he willingly did with the full knowledge of the British government. And he was a go-between between the Soviet Union and the American space program, because everything that he discovered or found out or was able to record, he obviously passed it on to NASA. And not many people know that NASA had a fairly high-profile office or group of people working at the Jodrell Bank Radio Telescope at the time of the Apollo missions. And again, many people are probably unaware of the fact that the Soviet Union did launch an unmanned satellite the day before Apollo 11 was launched. So it was due to land more or less at the same time as Apollo 11 was due to land, which obviously would concern NASA. Would the two spacecraft interfere with each other? Because they're both going to the same place. They weren't necessarily going to land at the same place. And so Bernard Lovell was asked to liaise with the Soviet Union to establish the actual flight path of the Soviet mission, which he did. And the Soviets were quite upfront about this. They were very willing to cooperate. And that comment about not landing a cosmonaut on the moon until they could ensure his safe return was actually a statement attributed to Bernard Lovell when he asked the question of the Soviet space program, headed at the time by Sergei Korolev, one of the geniuses behind space travel, who was the head of the Soviet space program. He said, "When are you going to send cosmonauts to the moon?" And the reply was, "When we can ensure their safe return due to the dangers of radiation." Now, that's a pretty strange statement to make if they thought that radiation was just a sort of peripheral hazard, rather like too much sunlight.
So presumably the Americans did their own radiation tests, and did the Soviets conduct their kind of like separate radiation tests by sending Geiger counters into space, essentially?
Well, Geiger counters were sent in space. That was the first time. That was conducted by James Van Allen, who was a professor at Iowa University, after whom the famous radiation belts are actually now named. The very first American rocket that could reach orbit was the Explorer 1. This was 1958, one of the very first launches. And James Van Allen was able to persuade NASA to put a Geiger counter on top of this rocket, along with the other instruments that were being carried, so that he could determine whether his theoretical conclusion that there were radiation bands around Earth was practically correct. So he did that, and he launched it, and the Geiger counter went up, and it stopped working. So it was inconclusive. So he decided to send another Geiger counter up, because the fact that it had stopped working indicated either it had broken down and it just wasn't functioning, or it was overloaded, i.e. the levels of radiation were much higher than had been predicted. So on Explorer 4, he put another Geiger counter, which was more powerful, and he sent this up. And sure enough, this recorded levels of radiation far in excess of anything that had been predicted. And in fact, one of the reports following this event in 1959 was, space is radioactive, which of course puts it into a picture quite conclusively, because at that time, this is the late 50s, nuclear bombs were going off all around the place, and we all understood about radiation and how dangerous it was. So to put a Geiger counter, which measures radiation levels, and to find that it was being activated extensively by the levels of radiation in space was a bit of a surprise. Nobody had expected this high level of radiation.
And have the Russians confirmed this with their own tests, or are you...
Yes, they have confirmed it. They've done more or less similar tests. And in fact, interestingly enough, excuse me, prior to the Apollo 8, whose anniversary we're approaching in December this year, December 1968 was the flight of Apollo 8. We might cover that later. Prior to that, a couple of months before that, the Soviet Union had launched an unmanned satellite which contained what we would describe as tortoises, a couple of tortoises. They described them as turtles. Maybe in the Soviet Union they have small turtles. I mean, a turtle, if you ask somebody what a turtle is, you imagine something about 3 foot long, flapping around looking rather beautiful. These were basically terrapins, that sort of size. And they stuck a couple of these on the top of a rocket, and along with some other biological things like seeds and plants, just to see what effect the radiation would have on them. And the thing came back. So the Soviet Union was perfectly capable of getting a rocket to the moon and back again. And when they unpacked it and they found that the tortoises still alive and the plants were unaffected, everybody said, "Oh, that's not a problem. Look, we can send live animals through these radiation belts and onto the moon. It can survive it." Well, of course they can survive it, because turtles can survive thousands of times greater level of radiation than humans can. So it's a completely erroneous argument to say that just because you can send a tortoise to the moon, you can send a man. That is an illogical, non-scientific statement to make, and I hope nobody makes it, because it's wrong. And it's always said that the only survivors of a nuclear explosion are cockroaches. They can survive anything.
So why is it you think turtles can survive much more radiation than humans?
They can survive 30,000 times greater levels of radiation than humans.
That's huge.
Is there any shells? That's why they've got mutant ninja teenage turtles and things.
There you go. I mean, that's why they're so popular, because they can survive the death rays being directed at them. So, I mean, humans are quite delicate mechanisms. And we're not really designed to travel in space. We're quite good down here on Earth, on the surface of Earth, where we don't get radiation, unless you spend too long soaking up the rays on the beach. Then you'll get radiation damage. It's called sunburn, which is a form of radiation damage. It's a pigmentation change. But why do you think radiation treatment is used to treat cancer? Because it kills it.
And the patient as well sometimes.
That's the major problem. That's the big drawback to radiation treatment. It has to be very, very carefully directed.
So the recent kind of missions where it's not been America doing space stuff and moon stuff, such as the Chinese and the Indians, etc. That's a fairly kind of within the past couple of decades, isn't it? And even the European Union have decided to kind of try and make a space rocket of some kind. Do you know if there's any plans of any other countries to try and land one of their men or women on the moon at all?
India is talking about it. They certainly have a space program, and they also get quite a lot of aid from Britain. So obviously, one and one equals two here. So it's time that Britain had a space program.
It'll be really interesting to see what happens with the India project, because it's completely separate from NASA. And if they find that they can't get somebody to the moon, or if they attempt it, and I don't want this to happen, but it may happen, they get fried going through the Van Allen radiation belt, that's going to have some very uncomfortable questions for NASA. Well,
exactly. Now, so far as I know, India are not intending at this time to send humans to the moon. They intend to send unmanned satellites.
Okay.
Which is relatively easy to do. Sending unmanned satellites anywhere is relatively easy to do. It's sending humans. They require so much protection, and so much cosseting, and so many additional features. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we've got these huge and unexplained delays on the new American space program to the moon, the Orion capsule, which is Apollo 2.0. It's a bit bigger than Apollo. It looks rather similar to Apollo, but guess what? It's got heat shield all over it. They're using the space shuttle heat shield tiles to protect the top part of it, and a completely new heat shield on the base of it where the major heat is generated. Why don't they use what was on Apollo? They tried it. Guess what? They tried it. It didn't work. That was the test. That was called EM1, Exploration Mission 1. It was launched in December 2014. Nearly 4 years ago. Come on, this is half the time the whole Apollo program took to get to the moon and back. And they can't even get a spacecraft to come back to Earth. Oh, goodness, what's going on?
Now, Marcus, I'm sure you're aware of the Mythbusters episode where they kind of try to debunk the alleged moon land faking theories themselves, especially things to do with the shadows and things like that. Are you aware of the show that I'm talking about?
Oh yes, definitely. I've watched it, and I've watched the Russian version of it too. What
did the Russians make of it? Are they kind of like pro NASA, anti NASA? How's their
The Russians completely destroyed what the Mythbusters attempted to show, because what the Russians tried, these are Russian filmmakers, who are totally familiar with the optics and the lighting and the cameras and everything associated with it. And they watched the Mythbusters show and they said, okay, well, let's see if we can recreate what they have claimed. And this is the famous Aldrin coming down the ladder photograph.
Yeah.
I think most people will be familiar with it. It's on Apollo 11, where you get Buzz Aldrin, dear old Buzz. That's why Buzz Lightyear is called Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story. It's named after him. Anyway, he's coming down the ladder, and he's lit up like a Christmas tree. You can see all the detail in his spacesuit, even though he's in the shadow of the lunar lander. You can see where the sun is. It's behind it. But in the shadow of the lunar lander, Buzz Aldrin appears to be lit up like a Christmas tree. So the Mythbusters show tried to demonstrate that this was totally okay because the special reflection off the lunar surface would be sufficient to illuminate the astronaut coming down the ladder in the shadow, and for that to be recorded onto Kodak Ektachrome transparency material using the Hasselblad camera operated by Neil Armstrong, who was obviously standing relatively close by in his brilliantly white spacesuit, which has obviously provide a fair degree of illumination reflected into the shadow area. So this is what the Mythbusters were trying to demonstrate had happened, which they obviously did, because they plastered their logo, busted, all over it. Busted.
So
busted.
If anyone wanted to watch the Russian version, I've not actually seen that yet. It sounds intriguing. What would you search on YouTube or Google videos?
Okay, if you go on to the website aulis.com,
right,
AULIS, and search in there for the. I can't remember the exact title of the show, but it does demonstrate it. It's about half-hour video that you can watch, or half-hour YouTube film that you can watch. If you go onto YouTube and put Russian Mythbusters busted, you should come up with it then as well. But anyway,
yes. Okay. Mythbusters exposed, Aulis online, different thinking. Yeah, we got it.
Got it.
Got it.
Yeah, Mythbusters exposed. That's the one. There you go. Yeah. Now, what the Soviets filmmakers did, they tried to recreate the set that they'd used on the Mythbusters show. Jamie and what's the other guy's name? Anyway, they put all this sort of material onto a tabletop, which they said had the same reflectivity as the lunar surface, and they put a little model of the Apollo lander and a little Lego type model of an astronaut coming down the ladder wearing a spacesuit, and they used one light source, and they tried to demonstrate that this light source was sufficient to illuminate the astronaut. It wasn't.
Yep, I'm looking at it right now. I think we've got a bit of echo. I don't know if you're speaking.
Wait, no, it's just me laughing, cackling away.
Oh, I can hear my own voice sometimes. Yeah, I can see it. Yes, if people go to aulis.com and simply put /mythbusters.htm, and you can see it. And yeah, the astronaut, their little Lego kind of astronaut figure, is in complete darkness. It's not lit up at all.
Yeah. Now, what the Mythbusters did, which the Russians discovered by doing it themselves, was that instead of, obviously, if you're on the moon, there are no clouds, there are no mountains nearby. This is Apollo 11. There are no mountains, so there's no other place for light to be reflected from. What the Mythbusters found was that they could make the appearance of the photograph real. But what the Russians found out was how they did it, which was to wear white coats. Well, of course, it would reflect light. Yeah. I mean, it's so pathetically easy to completely demolish the Mythbusters show. Now, when Jarrah White, who is an Apollo researcher from Australia, researching into the myth of Apollo, not the fact of Apollo, when he confronted Jamie, I forget what his second name, anyway, one of the Mythbusters presenters at a convention in America, Jamie said, "Oh, Mythbusters isn't science, it's entertainment." Which rather demolishes this whole idea that you can hang your coat on the Mythbusters show as an example of how this whole hoax business has been completely demolished. It hasn't.
The other guy's called Adam, Jamie and Adam.
That's right, Adam, Jamie and Adam. That's it. Now, when the Mythbusters then did a especially, obviously, expenses-paid trip to the McDonald Observatory in Texas to demonstrate how firing a laser beam at the lunar surface can get it reflected can only happen if there is this special mirror placed on the lunar surface by the astronauts. And they were doing all that. And they said, busted, of course you can't fire it at the moon and get a reflection back. You have to have a mirror there to reflect the laser beam back. Absolute rubbish. They obviously haven't done their research. Because MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had done exactly that 7 years earlier. They'd fired a laser beam at the lunar surface when there were no mirrors, there were no landers, there were nothing, 1962, and got a reflection back. And the Russians did the same thing. So the idea of requiring some special mirror on the lunar surface, which had to be placed by men, is no example of landing a man on the moon. In fact, it's the reverse.
Well, you can also land a lunar research rover type craft on the moon, as they've done many times anyway, with all the instruments and reflective mirrors anyway. So, like you say, it can be done mechanically.
Which is what the Soviets did twice.
And as Marcus, you said last time that even a laser beam, by the time it got to the moon, would be something like 1 kilometre wide. So they wouldn't even need to be that accurate with it.
Oh, exactly. So all this use of the mirrors on the moon as an example of, well, of course we landed on the moon. How else could you get a laser beam to reflect back? Is busted. Complete nonsense. Don't need it. Forget it.
Marcus, in preparation for our next guest, when we've got Stephen Bassett coming on, and for
Peter Bassett.
Sorry, Peter Bassett, not Stephen Bassett. Who's Stephen Bassett? He's in the UFO community.
He's a UFO guy. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Paranormal Research Group.
Ah, right. Okay. So Peter Bassett. Could you, for people who are unacquainted with your work on the photographs, could you maybe describe some of the discrepancies with the NASA photographs of what we're shown versus what should or shouldn't happen?
Okay. I think, first of all, we need to describe the camera that produced all these famous photographs, these iconic photographs, as they're called. The camera used by all Apollo astronauts was a Hasselblad 500 EL, which means electric motor drive camera, supplied by the Victor Hasselblad organization in Stockholm in Sweden. They built it to NASA specification, and the specification required the removal of the viewfinder, because if you're wearing a spacesuit, you've got your head in a helmet and your camera strapped to your chest, and you can't get your head down to look through the viewfinder, because the viewfinder on the Hasselblad is on the top of the camera, as anybody who's used one will know. So they took the viewfinder away. So you had to just point the camera using your body in the general direction of the subject you wanted to photograph. Now that's fine. You don't need a viewfinder to take a photograph. Most people will have tried it without a viewfinder and found that it wasn't terribly successful because they didn't get what they wanted and they cut somebody's head off. Another feature of the camera was it required manual focusing and manual setting of the shutter speed and the aperture ring. These are separate operations. Now, as I've said before, this may all sound terribly 20th century and old hat, but these were film cameras, and this was what was used on Apollo. They were not point and shoot cameras as we have today. They were not digital cameras, which records images in a completely different way to the way film cameras record it. So having said all that, we have our heroes on the lunar surface strapping their cameras to their chests so they can leave their hands free to salute the flag, pick up the rocks and talk to the president, and drive the cars, the little lunar rovers. They have to drive those around. So they have the camera strapped to their chest. They point the camera at the object they want to photograph, and they press the shutter button. The shutter button is on the front of a Hasselblad camera and is not visible from inside the spacesuit. When you're on the moon, you wear a full spacesuit. You wear the helmet, the gloves, the boots, the whole kit and caboodle. You can't wear half a spacesuit. So if you're wearing the gauntlets, which were supplied for the astronauts, these gauntlets are basically armored, like heavy-duty gardening gloves. How much can you feel through a heavy-duty gardening glove? Especially if it's pressurized at 4.8 pounds per square inch, which the spacesuits were. You can't tell if a photograph has been taken, because normally when you're photographing anything, you hear a click. That's actually the mirror moving out of the way of the light beam that comes through to be recorded on the CCD chip if it's a digital camera, or the film if it's a film camera. You don't hear that because in space you can't hear anything. There's no counter that you can see from inside your spacesuit, because the only counter on the Hasselblad camera is on the right-hand side of the magazine, and you can't see that from inside a spacesuit. So with all these restrictions on use, no viewfinder, manual control of all operations, shutter button out of sight, film counter out of sight, some of the most iconic images were taken on the lunar surface, NASA insists. They are correctly exposed, they're correctly composed, they're accurately focused, and there are thousands of them. And we're asked to believe that these were all taken under these quite adverse conditions for the operation of any camera. So
you'd also think with thousands being taken, if we're getting the best shots, there must be thousands. I mean, they could argue that there must be thousands more that were deleted or thrown away because they were bad shots, or they could argue that maybe they're just lucky. You know, everywhere on the moon is a good view, everywhere is a picturesque Kodak scene.
No, every single photograph taken on every Apollo mission is now available to view in sequence on at least 4 websites. I use the Lunar and Planetary Institute website.
So nothing got thrown away at all. There was nothing got
thrown away. Nothing got thrown away. And also another key point, I mentioned that this was a film camera. The film used was Kodak Ektachrome, rated at 160 ASA in those days. This is the 60s. ASA stands for American Standards Association. We're now more used to ISO, International Standards Organization. 160 is a relatively fast film. It was sensitive. You could take photographs in low light conditions. It's quite a sensitive film from that point of view. These films have to be then developed, processed. They have to be put into chemicals. Remember chemicals? They have to be put into chemicals so that the emulsion, which is light sensitive emulsion, can be developed to show what was photographed, what was on the film. The process used is quite complex, so the film couldn't be developed on the moon, obviously. It had to be returned to Earth before it could be developed. And the only way to ensure, because nobody actually knew the true conditions on the lunar surface that the cameras would be operating under, it would be advisable, and this is standard photographic practice, to do a test development. So you cut off a piece of the film, maybe about 7 or 8 inches long, which would probably destroy a couple of images, and you develop it as you think should be done, i.e. the normal development process. You then have a look and see what your result is. What do they look like? Are they correctly exposed? If they are correctly exposed, then you develop the rest of the film under the same conditions. If they're not correctly exposed, either overexposed or underexposed, you then could adjust some of the development to bring out an image. If it was overexposed or underexposed, you could get more of the correct image on the film. But none of this was done. There's no indication that any of the films had any strip cut off as a test strip for development. Now, maybe they thought they didn't need to. Maybe they thought they'd got the exposures correct and they could just go ahead and develop them. Now, where are these original transparency films? They're all held in especially air-conditioned, air-controlled, temperature-controlled vaults at the Johnson Space Center at Houston. The photographs that we see are copies taken from those original films. Nobody is allowed to handle those original films. To my knowledge, very, very few people have even seen them, let alone used them to produce images from them. Certain people have produced books, quite extensive books. Andrew Chaikin's book, Full Moon, was an example. He claimed to have seen the original films. Some were black and white, some were color. There were variations. on them. And the moon is not actually a particularly interesting place to photograph, other than the fact of getting there and photographing it. It's like climbing to the top of Everest. First person to climb to the top of Everest took the photograph, and everybody else has just copied it ever since. 4,000 people have climbed Everest now, but only 12 people, we're told, have walked on the lunar surface. But the most important thing to photograph was the equipment they took when they went there, allegedly. They took their lunar lander, this magic craft that looks like a couple of Boy Scouts have thrown together an overnight camping place, made out of curtain rods, duct tape, and aluminium foil.
I have to say, Marcus, the more I look at it, the more I think that's exactly what it looks like. It does look. I mean, as I grew up, thinking how wonderful it was that we went to the moon, and just accepting that man went to the moon in that ship, and looking at it, it just does look like a load of plastic rods with foil wrapped around it.
Yes. Now, maybe one could excuse the fact that it doesn't look terribly secure, does it? The panels seem to be a bit loose. They probably didn't rivet them on properly. But to be fair, a lot of what we see is just covering things which don't need to be pressurized. The only thing that needs to be pressurized is the compartment in which the astronauts sat, which is the top half of the lunar lander.
Am I right in thinking that the temperature of the moon is supposed to be twice that of a boiling kettle?
That's a fair analogy. It's not quite that high. It's 250 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
The boiling point of water is 212 degrees Fahrenheit, or 120 centigrade. Okay. Boiling point of water is 100 centigrade.
I'd love to know how they cooled their suits down.
That was the magic air conditioning.
How can you explain, because you must be aware of the argument of the believers of how they would explain cooling a spacesuit down to levels below a boiling kettle. What's their explanation?
I'd love to hear it, but
so they've not actually said. They've not actually said, Marcus, you're completely wrong. They've cooled it and then explained how it's cooled. They've not done that yet.
I've not heard that explanation. Now, those magic spacesuits, by the way, could they be used? Because they obviously protected the astronauts from the dangers of heat, excessive cold. Because don't forget, if you're standing in the shadow of the lunar lander, or a hill or anything, shadow of the lunar lander, you're in cold. Now, because there's no atmosphere on the moon, the switch from hot to cold is virtually instant. So if you're standing in the shadow, the temperature in the shadow of the lunar lander would be minus 150 degrees centigrade, because there's no heat. You can't transfer heat in a vacuum. So the sun is shining on one side of the lunar lander. It's not shining on the other side. You can then do the calculation of the temperature, the inside of the lunar lander will be. And it's 250 degrees Fahrenheit. 120 degrees centigrade. So if it's that hot, obviously that, bake a good chicken in there, but it's not a good place for people to try and work. So how do they cool it? Because you can't use air conditioning in a vacuum. There's nowhere to dump the heat. They say, no, it was radiated away. Right, yes, well, it would be radiated away, because that's a fairly routine way of losing heat in a vacuum. It's the only way you can lose heat in a vacuum is using radiation. Radiating heat from an object will cool it down. That's why the Earth is at the temperature it is. The average temperature of Earth is, I think, 14 degrees centigrade, because heat is radiated away. The solar constant, which is the amount of heat that falls on Earth, is the equivalent of 1,350 watts per square meter. It's hot. But it's absorbed, it's reflected away, and the average temperature over the Earth, this includes the dark side. When we go into darkness, obviously the temperature falls. Guess what? It's because there's no sunlight. But the explanation offered by many people who try to now desperately try to support the Apollo myth is they say, oh no, they landed early in the morning. So the sun was very low on the horizon. Therefore, it wasn't very, very hot. Oh, get a life, get some science, do some work, do some investigation. You'll find, no, the sunlight, as soon as it hits the lunar surface, no matter at what angle, is 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Bomb. And if you've got a lunar lander standing on the lunar surface, it's illuminated right across one side. It's not shining on the top. It's shining right on one side. We can prove that this is the case with the introduction of the space shuttle in 1981. It was not going into the problems surrounding the space shuttle and its launcher. The astronauts, and by the way, the space shuttle is real, the International Space Station is real, there's no problem with that. When the first astronauts were sent up in the space shuttle to work on satellites and repairing satellites and doing various routine operations in the space shuttle, in the loading bay of the space shuttle, which incidentally is 60 foot long and 20 foot in diameter, and it was designed specifically to carry the hexagon spy satellite. That's why it's the shape it is. Carried spy satellites, which is what the Hubble is. It's a spy satellite which looks the other way. Well, let's not go into that. So when the astronauts were working on their various tasks in the loading bay of the space shuttle with the doors open, because you couldn't really work and release a satellite with the doors closed, they're big folding barn door type things, they complained about how cold their hands got when they went into the shadow of the Earth, because the space shuttle orbits the Earth 200 miles up, and for half its flight it's in the shadow, for half its flight it's in sunlight. And when it got into the shadow of the Earth, they complained about how cold their hands got. And NASA said, oh, don't be so stupid, it's not cold up there. And they said, yes, it is. You try it. So what they did is NASA supplied them with some thermometers to measure the temperature as it changed when they went from sunlight into shadow. And guess what? When they went from sunlight into shadow, the temperature fell by over 100 degrees within a few minutes. And as they came into sunlight again from shadow, the temperature rose by over 100 degrees within a few minutes, i.e. virtually instant. It's what you expect.
I do recall actually on one of the missions where they couldn't get the shuttle bay doors closed because of the warping of the doors in the sunlight or the cold. I can't remember which way around it was. So there's obviously some structural integrity of the ship kind of at risk there when it's going from hot to cold and back forth. So you'd think the same sort of thing must be happening again with the lunar missions.
Well, exactly. In fact, it's a very good point you make about the space shuttle doors warping. Yes, they did. They warped when they were in sunlight. They expanded, which is what happens when you heat metal up. It expands, which is why every time you see film of the space shuttle orbiting in sunlight, the space shuttle doors are pointing down towards Earth. Because what they found was that if they flew the space shuttle upside down, i.e. with the heat shield facing towards the sun, the space shuttle doors could then be opened quite easily. If they turned it the other way up with the space shuttle doors pointing towards the sun, they couldn't get them. Well, it wasn't they couldn't get them open. They could get them open. They couldn't get them closed. So that's how accurate NASA are in their research in finding out how temperature affects things in space.
So there is a possibility, you could argue, that if they're landing a lunar module on the moon and the side that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong or whoever is coming out and it's in the shadow, there could be a problem with either shutting the door or opening the door, depending on where the shuttle, where the lunar module is on the moon and things like that.
Yes. Now, all the Apollo landers, they all landed with their exit door, and you can always tell where the exit door is on any of the Apollo missions, because it's above one of the 4 struts that has the ladder mounted on it. The ladder was to allow the astronauts to walk down onto the lunar surface. Above that strut is the door. Now that door has to allow a fully suited astronaut through it. And the door measures 30 inches square. And if you go and measure an astronaut in a spacesuit, you'll find that he's pretty close to that width. And his backpack is obviously going to take up a bit of room, because you can't get out of the space. You can't get out into space without wearing a full spacesuit, or you'll die. End of story. There's no argument about that. This door, which was made of aluminium, had to withstand the internal pressure of the lunar lander, which was quoted at 5 pounds per square inch. That's about the lowest pressure that humans can survive at without their blood starting to, or getting the bends, which is basically the gases in human blood will start to expand and kill you in the end. So this door, 30 inches square. Let's do a bit of maths here. 30 times 30 is 900, times 5 is 4,500. That's 2,000, that's just over 2 tons of pressure on this aluminium door from the inside the spacecraft when it is pressurized. That is vastly in excess of virtually any building standards for warehouses, where the loading levels are set at several £100 per square foot. So we've got this anomaly here with aluminium, which is not the strongest metal around. Tungsten would be a stronger material to use, but no, the spacecraft, the lunar lander, is made of aluminium.
That's the same material for aircraft, isn't it, that are pressurized, but they're in the upper atmosphere where there is a thin air, but not a vacuum.
Would they argue, oh, well, it's not just any aluminium, it's space grade, NASA grade aluminium?
Well, they'd try arguing that, because how can one refute it? Because NASA won't release the formulation. Yes, it was honeycombed. It was made of honeycomb construction. But some of the descriptions of it, I think it was Chris Kraft, who was one of the Apollo command directors, was very concerned that the astronauts didn't poke a finger through the side of the spacecraft. What's he talking about? Because it was made of thin sheets of aluminium. Now, if you poke a finger through, you can get some cooking foil, aluminium cooking foil, make it, 3 or 4 layers of it. You could poke your finger through it.
I'm not sure I'd want to go. How many miles is it to the moon? How many thousand?
240,000 on average.
I'm not sure I'd want to go 240,000 miles in an aluminium craft where there's a possibility my finger could poke through it.
No, but these guys had the right stuff, don't forget.
I'm really looking forward to our believer in the second half of this. I'm really looking forward to this.
In fact, there's a serious point about the right stuff. All astronauts were military, ex-military. If you're in the US military, and same with the British military, probably the French, the Chinese, the Japanese, all military, if you're an officer entrusted with some pretty high-tech kit, which these guys were, they were test pilots, amongst other things, you would sign oaths of secrecy. Standard, it's routine practice in military. You will sign oaths of secrecy, which basically means that when you're given an order, you obey it. And if you discover things which maybe you're not quite in agreement with, you won't question it. So when the 27 astronauts were told, or 24 of them, I should say, when 24 astronauts were told, you're flying to the moon, guys, they say, yes, sir. If they were asked to jump, they would only have one question. How high, sir? They would not question it.
And they were probably given a briefing, something along the lines of, we need to have one up on the Russians. You guys need to do your bit for your country, even though we're kind of misdirecting the American public. It's all in the interests of national security and all that kind of thing.
I think you've summarized it brilliantly. That's exactly what happened. Can I prove it? No, because they will not break ranks. None of the astronauts still alive, and Buzz Aldrin's still alive. You can go and ask him, he'll punch you in the face if you do. Which is what he meted out to Bart Sibrel when Bart Sibrel confronted him and said, would you swear on the Bible that you walked on the lunar surface? Whack! Well, no, actually, he'd done that before, and because Buzz Aldrin would not swear on the Bible that he'd done that, and nor would Neil Armstrong, by the way. A few of them did. Bart Sibrel rather unwisely pursued Buzz Aldrin into a hotel lobby and said, "You're a thief and a liar." Whack! To be fair, Bart Sibrel has since apologized for his, shall we say, his behavior was not acceptable, which he now recognizes, and he has apologized for it. But it was a fair question to ask.
It was.
And to watch Neil Armstrong squirming, highly embarrassed, when confronted with a Bible or a choice of the swear on the Bible or here's $5,000 for a charity of your choice, if you will swear that you have walked on the lunar surface. And he walked away. He would not do it.
Yeah, it was a very interesting psychological moment, I guess, for anyone that's interested in psychology, because I think we can perhaps discuss that a little bit more in part two, where Richard D. Hall, in his latest research with the guy called Peter, I forget his surname now, another Peter, who has done the voice analysis of the astronauts, particularly from the first lunar mission, mostly on Neil Armstrong, where he's taking footage of Neil Armstrong maybe a year and a half after his alleged lunar walk, appearing on the sky at night with Patrick Moore. And Patrick Moore's thrown all the questions, what's it like on the moon, etc., etc., and Neil Armstrong saying various answers. And this guy has analysed it, and he works for the FBI and the police and things in America. And he's basically come up with sort of a report that sort of suggests that he's not quite being truthful, let's say.
That's a very interesting series. It's a series of 3 programs, isn't it? Analysing the astronauts. And it's a very, very revealing program, because this guy knows what he's talking about when he's listening to people who are up in court. Are they telling the truth? I mean, it's what you expect. So for him to analyze it, in fact, this guy Peter, he was actually quite upset about what he discovered.
That's right. Yeah,
I find it. I believed the Apollo program. So for me to establish that they maybe are not telling the truth, as far as I can tell, was very, very upsetting. But it's a very revealing program.
Yeah, I think his wife was also, she does the same sort of job, and he actually passed the whole thing over to her to have a second opinion. She came up with exactly the same kind of thing. They both analysed it. And he worked on also in an earlier Rich Planet show. This is obviously where he met this guy and got him to do his research on voice analysis and things, was on the Madeleine McCann case. And he got an interview with the McCanns from an Australian TV show, and he analysed all their responses to what happened on the night Madeleine went to bed and was subsequently allegedly taken. And he actually sort of said, no, they're lying, she's dead, and they're covering up that fact, basically. So that's when Richard D. Hall said, could you analyse the Apollo astronauts, basically? And so that's the result of that. So yeah, it is a very, very really revealing interview, one with maybe a lot of more of the Apollo defenders perhaps are not aware of, so we can maybe find that out in part 2, which we will have to take a break now, gentlemen, because we do need a break, and in part 2 we'll hopefully be joined by an official, if you like, of the Apollo defenders, and that will be Peter Bassett of the Astronomy Roadshow. So join us in part 2 on the Paranormal Peep Show with Marcus Allen, Andrew Chaplin and myself, and our other guest, Peter Bassett.
You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network. 100% goblin free. Excellent.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the Paranormal Peep Show with myself, Andrew Chaplin and Neil Geddesward, and we are joined in part 2 with Marcus Allen again of Nexus Magazine. We've been talking about the Apollo Moon missions from 1969 to 1972. Did man really land on the moon? Marcus says they probably didn't, and he can tell us why. But we're joined also with an expert into the moon missions as well as space and astronomy. He knows a lot about rockets, the systems that drive them, the whole of NASA. He understands all that kind of technology. Maybe that people like Andy and myself, laymen, will only have a partial understanding of things. He also knows about the stars in the sky, and that's Mr. Peter Bassett of the Astronomy Roadshow. Welcome, Peter, to part 2 of the Paranormal Peep Show.
Oh, thank you. It's nice being the guest.
Thank you. Peter, the Astronomy Roadshow, in the briefest of terms, what is it and how did you start it?
Right, it's a mobile planetarium system. It's got 4 different sized domes, and including the claim to fame of the largest in the UK. It's 8 metres across. But I started from an idea of actually in Arizona. I was a bit fed up with my old job and took a few months off work and did some travelling. And some a couple of teachers in Arizona gave me the idea. So I just come back home, did a bit more research, found out just 2 companies in the entire country that did the same kind of service to 30,000 schools. So I knew there was a market for that. So I just bought the equipment and 18 months later packed up my job and started it. That's 25 years ago this January.
Wow. So you're turning the nation of Britain into keen stargazers, we hope. So
I'm hoping so.
Yeah, young astronauts, young rocket scientists, that's and maybe young out there. You've met a few young proteges that might possibly go to the moon again or to Mars, perhaps. You just don't know. You know, you've inspired these people. Whilst you're out in space, you're looking in the night sky. I think Andy wants to ask you a question regarding that. I mean, apart from seeing satellites and planets and stars, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, welcome to the show. It's great to have you along. And as you know, this is the Paranormal Peep Show, so we have a little bit of an emphasis on the paranormal side of things. And what I was going to ask is, have you ever seen anything along the lines of something you can't explain, light anomalies, any UFOs? Have you been abducted? Have you been probed? Anything of that nature at all?
I haven't been that lucky. I have had 3 unusual sightings, yes, things that I can't explain. And I mean, most astronomers just peer down telescopes and look at an object a 1/10 of a degree across, whereas I prefer to look at the entire sky at once. It's handy for meteors, satellites, that sort of thing. And but yeah, I've had 3 unusual sightings, 2 just visual sightings. Of course, didn't expect these things to happen, and wasn't ready with a camera or anything. And a 3rd one I was ready, and this one I photographed and actually got on one of my websites. But my first one was about 12. I just saw 5 objects in a straight line coming directly from north to south, and it was like overtaking each other, like a race sort of thing. Satellites can't do that. Aircraft can't go at the speed that these were going at.
I was just going to say, they wouldn't be jet aircraft, anything like RAF?
No, they crossed the sky from horizon to horizon in about 8 or 9 seconds.
Wow.
And I had an indication of height because they're all night long. They had a very thin cloud, very slow moving, hour by hour across the sky, and I was seeing the stars still through them because they're very thin. But it's obviously because they were very slow moving, it gave an indication of the cloud's altitude, and these objects faded as he went behind these clouds. If they didn't fade, obviously they're below them, but it was actually above them, and so that was really quite bizarre.
And what colour were they, and how big?
Pure white, points of light, just to star-like objects. And obviously there's a long way off because it's above those clouds, but there's like overtaking each other. So if you can imagine numbered 1 to 5,
yeah,
number 2 would overtake 1, 3 would overtake 2, and so on. And it'd go like a link all the way across the sky. It's really
would you say it's kind of like a playful kind of?
Yeah, almost like showing off. But even to this day, I mean, this is going back to the 70s, so even to this day, I just can't explain these vehicles at all.
And what was your
natural?
Yeah. Okay. So, and what was your second experience?
Second one, I was observing the meteor showers, quadrantids, which is in January, pretty cold. But I saw 3 objects coming apart. Basically, I didn't see the original breakup. I thought it was just a meteor breaking up. It was a really deep red colour, which was quite unusual. And then they all started spreading apart across the sky fairly rapidly. But the object to the right suddenly shot at right angles to the right-hand side. And then the second one followed it a few seconds later, and the third one whizzed across almost to the south and then joined the others and disappeared in the distance. So 3 were coordinating with each other. And again, that sighting was about 6-7 seconds. And I've never seen aircraft perform like that.
And did you say they were all red, or one of them was
they were all
red?
red, all three, equal brightness, one flickering, no sounds, and literally the whole thing lasted about 8 seconds. But to this day, I just can't explain it. So I'll keep an open mind on the subject, but what these things were, I've got no idea. I've never seen natural phenomena do that.
I was going to say, it's definitely not anything like anything burning up in the atmosphere or anything like that.
No, because they're going a straight line. They wouldn't curve at right angles, all three of them, and then follow each other. So they're obviously coordinated amongst each other.
And what was your third experience?
Third one was just last year, actually, April, and observing out in Arizona. And we built this camera platform out there, and it's the first night of observing, and I imaged something quite unusual. It's a red-coloured dish-like object. It's in the photograph, actually. And the stars were like had lights reflecting from them, from these like streamers in the sky. Streamers drifted one into the other. So anyway, I managed to record it, but I didn't actually see it visually. I was looking in the opposite direction, and I just had the camera on auto, just taking pictures one after the other. So, but I can't explain what was going on there.
Very, very odd.
You're sounding, Andy.
Presumably with anyone like Patrick Moore or Brian Cox over the years.
I have actually. I've met them both.
What's their views on this kind of thing? I'm assuming, I could be completely wrong, but I'd assume they disbelieve in anything of this nature, or do they?
Yeah, it does actually. Well, both do. But then Brian Cox is not an observer. So Patrick Moore was, but always peering down telescopes.
So you say Brian Cox is not an observer?
No, he's not an observer, no, he doesn't go out stargazing. He does when he's on TV, but he doesn't actually go out observing in his own observatory and
well, he should do.
I know he should, yeah. He's more a physicist. Astronomy is a sideline.
Andy, you're sounding a little bit distorted coming through. There's a Skype issue on your line, because Peter's coming through very, very clear. So, I mean, Marcus, you can hear him. Definitely, he's coming through with a crackly digital breakup type of thing. So, I don't know if you'll unplug your USB and replug it in maybe, or log out of Skype and come back in.
I'll log out and come back in.
Sure. Okay. In the meantime, we'll carry on with the show. So, we're talking Apollo with Marcus Allen and Peter Bassett. Marcus, you're obviously of the opinion that Apollo never quite happened the way we're led to believe. And you obviously started that with your interest in photography, didn't it?
That's correct, yes. I started looking at some of the NASA photographs that were supplied in support of their contention that they'd landed men on the moon.
Any better?
Brilliant. Sound crystal clear. Sorry to interrupt, Marcus. Carry on.
That's very, very odd. It must be a Skype glitch, because I haven't done anything other than come back in.
Okay.
Sorry, Marcus, you were saying?
Yeah, I was just saying that I started probably the same time Peter started his Astronomy Roadshow about 25 years ago. So maybe there was something in the water at the time that people had to change direction and take on new viewpoints. Anyway, I started looking at the photographs because, having been trained as a photographer, technically trained as a photographer in the 60s, I was fully conversant with the equipment that we were told was used on Apollo. That's the Hasselblad EL500 EL camera. And the lenses that we used, I've used similar cameras, used similar equipment. I was familiar with the Kodachrome film that was used to record the images. So I had a look at them, and I thought, well, I know what cameras can and cannot do. I know what film can record, what film can't record. And I looked at these things, and I thought, given the conditions that we're told the photographs were taken under, i.e. on the lunar surface, with the only single light source being the sun, it seems a bit unlikely that the amount of detail that we see in some of the shadow areas could be recorded on the film without additional light source. And I heard that the additional light source was supposedly the reflective properties of the lunar surface, which I find extremely unlikely, because as a photographer I know that you won't use a road surface which has the same reflectivity as the lunar surface, i.e. 8%, as a reflector. So I thought, well, there must be some other explanation. Maybe I've just read this wrong. Maybe I've just got the wrong end of the stick. Maybe I'm just complete idiot. But the more I looked at it, the more I found it wasn't me who was the idiot. It was the people who were trying to convince me that what I was looking at was supposedly correct. And the more I've looked at it, the more I find that I'm correct, and many people trying to promote NASA's Apollo deception are coming unstuck. End of story.
Okay, Peter, what's your opinion on the Apollo photographs initially?
Well, I don't see nothing wrong with them. The moon does reflect light, that's why we can see it. And it partly fills in shadows. And all we've got to do is open up the aperture, an extra 3 or 4 stops, and that will actually make up for it. You let extra lights coming in, so you can actually image parts of the photograph, within the shadow.
Well, that would be true. You're quite right to say that if you want to film something in shadow, yes, you open up the aperture a few stops. But in doing that, you're also going to overexpose the directly illuminated surface behind the lander. We're talking about Apollo 11 in this case. The directly illuminated surface would be severely overexposed if you're going to, say, open up 3 or 4 stops. But it doesn't appear to be the case. It is not overexposed. And yet the illumination within the dark shadow area cast by the lander, in this case of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder, is lit up like a Christmas tree. And that is not the effect of this special lunar reflective surface, because the lunar reflective surface, yes, of course you can see the moon, but if you look directly at the sun, you're going to damage your eyes. We know that the light reflected from the lunar surface is considerably less than that reflected off the sun. In fact, it's 8%. Now, 8%, yes, you can see the moon. Of course you can. That's not in question. What I'm saying, and is in question, is could the photographs taken on the lunar surface without the addition of an extra light source be as perfect as they appear to be? And I say they couldn't.
Well, I'll say they could. The surface behind the lunar module is not vastly overexposed, but it's a little overexposed. So
it's certainly not overexposed by 3 or 4 stops. Maybe half a stop. Yes, I would agree there.
Yeah, it is a little over. And don't forget, you can, using darkroom techniques, push and pull different parts of the photograph.
No, you can't. No, you can't.
You can.
These are transparency material that is being used. The Kodak Ektachrome film.
Yes, it was transparent, that's right.
It's a transparency material. So when you develop the film, yes, you can take prints of it. And that's what was done. Because very, very few people have even seen the original transparency material, which is kept at the Johnson Space Center.
That's right, it's priceless.
Well, it's priceless because, well, okay, yeah, let's not go there. Right, so the original transparency material is then duplicated, and various people claim to have duplicates of the original, and that may well be the case, because it's perfectly possible to duplicate a film. Whether it is the original film, the priceless one kept out of sight and out of touch of anybody in Johnson Space Center, is a matter for debate. If you're going to then take prints of that transparency, that's quite possible. That's the logical thing to do, because transparency material records very good detail, very good color rendition as well. Prints can be taken, but negative film was not used. Now, when you take prints, yes, you can adjust the result of the prints. But don't forget, we're talking back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Color photography was relatively new at this point. Relatively new. I'm not saying it was recently introduced, because Kodak introduced color photography many years before that. But to get the sort of result that we have been presented with would require a vast amount of manipulation. Now, whether there was digital manipulation available at the time, I doubt it very much, because Photoshop didn't come in until the late 1980s. So it would have to be done manually within a darkroom to produce the level of print, and it would be identifiable. I mean, I've done enough darkroom work myself to know what you can and can't achieve in a darkroom, and it's surprising how much can be done, primarily with black and white. And many of the Apollo photographs are black and white. But it's not so much whether it's overdeveloped or underdeveloped, because that can be controlled. Part of what I question is the position of the camera that took the photographs, because there are so many anomalies in the physical position. I'm not talking about shadow angles, I'm not talking about shadow direction. I mean, that's actually a minor diversionary tactic. What I'm looking at are things which cannot be diversionary tactics because they're there staring you in the face. For instance, the only photograph allegedly ever taken of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface, other than the reflection of him allegedly taking Buzz Aldrin's photograph of Man on the Moon, the only other photograph of full length of Neil Armstrong is his back view as he unpacked something from the lunar lander. And in the same photograph is a photograph of the American flag, which has just been erected on the lunar surface. In that particular photograph, the horizon of whatever, well, let's call it the lunar surface, for want of a better word, the horizon in the photograph is virtually below the level of the flag. If you look at another photograph, including the American flag in the same photograph, the famous one of Buzz Aldrin saluting the American flag after they'd planted it on the surface, the horizon is in a completely different position relative to the flag. Now, the point I'm making on this is that the position of the horizon in any photograph, whether you take it on the Moon or on Earth or on Jupiter or Uranus or Saturn or anywhere, the position of the horizon is relative to the camera position that took the photograph. So the higher the camera position will be the higher the relative position of the horizon in the photograph. It's straightforward optics. There's no trickery involved. You can. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with that if you squat down near the ground, the horizon will appear relatively low. If you stand up on top of a stepladder, the horizon will be above the object you're photographing. That's just the way light works. That's just the way cameras work. So what
in layman's terms, Marcus, you're saying basically that what we're shown isn't the correct angle of where the horizon should be.
But is the lunar surface completely flat, like a billiard ball table?
No, of course it's not. Of course it's not. It's got small craters. It's got little hummocks, but it's not got mountains.
As you walk around, if you went out inch by a couple of feet, the flag is relatively close to you, it would make a massive difference between the angle between the flag and the horizon.
No, it wouldn't. No, 2 foot wouldn't make any difference
at
all. 2 foot would not make any difference given the camera position, because you're looking down on the astronauts. You can see the top of their helmets. If the camera was on their chest, you couldn't see the top of the helmet. The same thing happens on Apollo 12, where Al Bean appears in a sequence of photographs. On one occasion, you can see straight into his camera lens, because he's wearing a camera as well, which Buzz Aldrin wasn't. You're looking straight into the camera lens. A few photographs later, you're looking down on top of his camera and on top of his helmet and on top of his backpack. How does that happen?
There are thousands of pictures taken. I can't, without actually seeing the exact image you're referring to in front of me, I can't really comment on that. I mean, Marcus, thousands of images.
Marcus, it's going to be a bit of a difficult thing. As we're talking, is there any way that you could source the image off the internet and maybe put it in the message compartment so we can have a look at it?
Have a look. See what I can find. I've actually got the actual. Can you still hear me?
Yeah,
we can. I'll tell you what, Marcus. You see if you can find the images you'd like to have a look at. And what I'd like to ask Peter is, there's an image that NASA took, or one of the astronauts took, allegedly on the Moon, focusing in on one of the wheels of the Lunar Rover, and you can clearly see that there's no tracks either side of it. And I'd like a sort of an explanation on that.
I know that image you're referring to. The rover was handheld out of the lunar module, pulled away from the lunar module, unpacked, unfurled. Would it have tracks either side of the wheels?
So you're saying that
it's just been unpacked. It hasn't gone anywhere yet.
So it's just been plunked down.
Yes. Okay. And the lunar module was behind the photographer when the picture was taken.
No, sorry.
Be tracks if it hasn't yet been driven.
I've examined this in some detail. is on the other side of the lander from where it was unpacked. So it had to have made tracks when it moved from the side. If you're looking at the lander, looking into the ladder and the door, the lunar rover was packed on the right-hand side. This photograph is taken with the lander on the right-hand side of the photograph, indicating that the rover had moved from where it was unpacked to where it was now photographed, and it had somebody sat in it driving it. So, and you can see all the footprints around it. It had been moved from where it was unpacked or unassembled, or assembled rather, because it was pulled down from the right-hand side of the Apollo landing craft on a 15, 16, and 17. It was pulled down from the right-hand side as you look straight at the lander. But there are photographs showing that the rover moving considerable distance away from the lander with no wheel tracks. This is what's being questioned.
How much did it weigh, the lunar rover?
465 pounds on Earth.
On Earth.
Yeah, on Earth.
So at 1/6 the gravity, what would it? I mean,
75 pounds.
Okay.
Two adults can carry it easily.
Yeah, they can carry it, but it would still leave a track, because the same way that an astronaut...
The astronauts would leave tracks.
...weighed 300 pounds on Earth, so they would weigh about 50 pounds on the moon. They had 2 boots, so 25 pounds each, and you could see their footprints quite easily. Same sort of weight distribution on the lunar rover, 75 pounds on the moon, 4 wheel tracks, or 4 wheels, so that's just under 20 pounds per wheel, about the same amount of weight as the astronaut was exerting through his boots. But the rover doesn't appear to leave any tracks at all. None at all. And yet there are photographs showing them. This is an anomaly.
Presumably as well, when they put the rover down on, there would have been some dust that would have kind of kicked up a little bit.
Yes, you would have thought so, wouldn't you?
There'd be almost like a little ridge or crater around the tyres themselves, even if there weren't any tracks and you just plunked it down. There'd be some disruption of the dust around it.
Yeah. So this shows, in my view, that this was filmed on some sort of stage set here on Earth under studio conditions, and the set dresser got the set wrong.
I'm going to have a quick look at this. Marcus, did you find the image you'd like to talk to Peter about at all?
I haven't found it yet, no, because what I'm going to have to do is to use one of my, because the best image I can use is in one of my presentations, which shows the eight photographs in sequence that I used to show the 2 photographs of Al Bean on Apollo 12, one of which is very, very familiar to a lot of people. It's one that's used often because it shows them in sequence, and this is the point I'm making when I talk about it, because the camera position is quite obviously different. Quite obviously. I mean, there's really no debate about it at all. It's in a very different position, and yet it was on the same roll of film taken by the same photographer, Pete Conrad, who took the photographs, but it's of the same subject. And it's the only place I found it is when I put the slide together for my presentation. So if you've got that, you'll find it.
How can he? I'm just thinking, if they're both carrying this lunar rover across the surface to plonk it down a few feet away from the lunar module, are we saying then that Pete Conrad took the photographs after they've plonked it down, or whilst they're carrying it across?
No, sorry. The photograph with Pete Conrad and Al Bean is Apollo 12, and that is a completely different subject we're talking about. The one on the lunar rover, they were only on Apollo 15, 16, and 17. I think the one we're talking about is where it shows no wheel tracks but lots of boot prints, is Apollo 16, as far as I recall. But I could be wrong. Could even be Apollo 17. But there are several photographs showing the lunar rover, because obviously they wanted to photograph it. They're very proud of it. It cost them $60 million, and they were going to leave it there. So they wanted to photograph it, show what it looked like. So they photographed it, but you see so many of the images where I have no wheel tracks, either in front or behind this lunar rover, but yet there are plenty of astronaut boot prints on the Lunar in the same photograph.
So one thing that strikes me, because I'm on the Google search of these photos. Okay, so let's, even if we had the scenario where they've taken it off and they're going to plonk it down, we've got quite a wide-angled view where there's quite a bit of space between the lunar lander and the lunar rover. You'd think they'd want to plonk it down as soon as possible, literally get it off the lunar
I was thinking that.
put it down immediately.
Put the two front wheels on there, yeah.
We've got at least, I'd say 5 meters, maybe more, between the lunar rover and the lunar lander.
That's not very far.
Also, don't forget with this famous lunar rover, it's a bit of a magic vehicle, this thing. So it's nobody can really go back and fix it because it's up on the moon, we're told. But this lunar rover, when it was packed onto the lunar lander, it was folded up in an extremely sophisticated and very well thought out way. When they took it off the lunar rover to use it, they basically had to build a car on the moon. They had to add all the equipment to it because it couldn't be stored in the same location as it was when it was transported on the lunar lander. They had to get all the bits and pieces, the batteries, the TV camera, the still camera, the antenna to transmit the famous TV images to Earth. I wonder how the hell they did that. And because it wouldn't have enough power, but let's not go there for the moment. That's yet another anomaly. So the astronauts had to assemble this car on the lunar surface. It's an electric car. It could drive 20-odd kilometers on the lunar surface, which is probably about the same distance as most electric cars can go today. So if they lost that technology as well. So they put this car together. They drove it around on the lunar surface. And yet there are photographs which show the lunar rover with plenty of wheel tracks. There's plenty of them. You can see them. Trouble is they don't add up either. On Apollo, I believe it's Apollo 15, you see the wheel tracks in several photographs on the same roll of film, and one set of wheel tracks is at 90 degrees to the direction of travel, and the other set of wheel tracks on the same roll of film shows a herringbone pattern, which is what you expect, because the wheels were made with herringbone metal pieces, so that it had some sort of grip, presumably, on the lunar surface. But how come you've got what looks like a Jeep wheel track on the same roll of film? And it makes no sense at all. It's an anomaly. It's an inconsistency. It's an unexplained detail. It's something that NASA will not address. So I'm hoping, Peter, you will be able to correct me on this. Please go ahead.
I can't see the picture in front of me.
I think the problem we're going to have is this. Marcus, have you got that picture to hand at all, or do you know what we'd be looking for?
Well, if I had, would you be able to see it?
Yes, you could drag it into the
chat
in
box.
Skype. There's like a message box, and I've typed a couple of things in there.
Top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see like a little chat balloon. It's very square looking. You click on it, and what it does, it shoves all our 3 pictures to the left and opens up a bit of a chat window. You can see there where, hopefully if you manage to get to it, where Andy has put a link to some Google images, and at the very bottom of that field it says type a message, but also you can add a photograph to there's an icon, a smiley icon face, insert an emoticon, or it says send an image, and you can click that one and send your image through that to us, and we can hopefully all see it. I don't know if you got that at all.
Yeah, I think I have, but the trouble is getting the photograph, because it's actually on. It's on the presentation I do. It's not I mean, they're all NASA photographs. This particular one, which shows, if we can find one photograph which shows the flag on the lunar surface, then we get another one which shows the flag on the lunar surface in a completely different position. The photograph was taken from much higher up. Now, Peter, I know, has said that the lunar surface was not flat. I totally agree. It was not flat. It had little craters and little humps and little bumps. But in order to get such a variation in position of the lunar horizon, the surface was not sufficiently bumpy or cratered enough, because the astronaut does not say he was standing in a crater when he took one photograph and standing on a hill when he took another one. It doesn't say that.
Is what you need for every single photograph taken to express what he's standing on.
Sorry, I didn't get it. Are you saying that he said that he was what he did?
No, there's no point in mentioning every single photograph that he takes, the position that he's in.
No, because obviously he didn't.
Walking around on the moon.
Because he didn't consider there'd be very much point in saying it. I totally agree.
Not a point, really.
No, there's not a lot of point, but you're now using that unevenness of the surface to explain away the photograph. And I'm saying I don't think the surface was that uneven. Yes, it is uneven.
It was uneven. So, the height of the flag will appear to be different against the horizon as you go up and down and forwards and backwards and so on.
I think what will probably answer this is having maybe a topographic kind of chart of how far they went out and kind of what angles they might have climbed up, because I'm seeing a lot of photographs where, generally speaking, the lunar lander is in a fairly flat area. There are hills and things, but I can't see any astronauts actually on any of the hills at any point. I mean, yes, it will go up and down, obviously, but there's no kind of like prominent hills that they're going up and down on that I can see.
No, we also have to take into account that the plain colouring of the surface makes it a lot blander than it really is.
What is the point?
Flatter. It seems flatter than it really is, simply because of the evenness of the shading of the surface.
Well, could it be that it is flatter? Not just seems flatter. That, I mean, I've heard this argument before. Oh, they were standing in a crater. Oh, they were standing on a hill. To answer the point that I make about the position of the horizon, but nobody's ever proved how far how deep the crater has to be, or how high the hill has to be to create that image.
Wasn't there also some video footage of, and I don't know which mission, which astronauts it was, where they're on certain day of the mission, I think it's probably one of the later missions, and they're on a hill of sorts, both astronauts, and it's logged as on this day they are at such and such a place, and then like the next day they're at a different place, but in fact both images are the same because the rocks are in the foreground match up completely to the previous day's mission. Have you heard that?
Oh yeah, I've heard that many times. It's it's a mislabeled film roll.
Oh, okay, that's how they explain it.
But those images do appear to be virtually identical. The rocks are in the same relative position. It's as if the camera was in the same position, but it's a different EVA. I think it's between EVA 1 and EVA 3. And there are two astronauts in one image and one astronaut in the second image. But I'm prepared to go along with the fact that it could be a mislabeled film roll.
Moving on to a different...
NASA didn't get everything right.
Moving on to a slightly different issue, Peter, could you give an explanation as to the cooling system of the spacesuits that the astronauts wore and how they kind of like cooled them down?
I couldn't go into that much detail. No, I'm not an engineer.
Okay.
I'm not going to start making things up.
Okay, is it correct that the temperature of the moon in the sun areas would be roughly kind of boiling point, that sort of temperature?
It's actually above boiling point, yeah.
Above boiling point. Because one of the contentions that I find difficult to kind of go against is this notion that how can you have a cooling system that can make a spacesuit comfortable given extreme temperatures, and not just in the heat, but also flipping between cold and hot, where it's extremely cold and extremely hot.
Okay. Now the thing is, you have to define where the temperature figures come from in the first place, about the maximum and minimum temperatures on the moon. The maximum temperature on the equator, when the sun's overhead. Don't forget, the day on the moon lasts for 2 weeks. So by the time it's overhead, the sun's been shining for a week continuously, and the soil is pretty dark, so it absorbs the heat. And now you take your temperature basic reading, or estimated, calculated, and it's about 130 degrees centigrade. But if you've got something that's pure white, reflecting heat, and it's in and out of the shade, spinning around, sometimes in the lunar module shade, so it's completely in the shade, sometimes out in the sun, the astronaut turns around, You haven't got an overall 130 degrees centigrade temperature for that spacesuit. It hasn't had a week for it to heat up.
What are you talking about?
Yes, it would.
It heats up virtually instantly. As soon as the sunlight hits the surface, at whatever angle...
You're talking about white spacesuits, not a dark lunar soil.
Okay, white spacesuit.
That's what it's based on. The temperature is based on the temperature of the soil.
How much is reflected off that white spacesuit?
About 70% or so.
70%.
I should figure off. I'm not an engineer on spacesuits. Okay, I'm into astronomy.
All right. Astronomy includes the sun.
Yes, it does.
I assume, and it also includes the moon.
It does.
Right. If I say that the lunar surface, as you've just stated, is heated by the sun, that's correct. But because the moon has no atmosphere, I think we can agree on that.
Yeah.
It has no atmosphere, therefore the radiant energy of the sun is applied instantly to whatever surface it hits. Yes, it will reflect off some more higher reflective surfaces, and an astronaut spacesuit is relatively reflective. But it's not totally reflective. It's not a mirror.
No, it's not.
Right, nor is the spacecraft.
Right.
The lunar lander will reflect a certain amount of the energy reaching it, but it will absorb a considerable amount as well. So the interior of the lunar lander, using the blackbody radiation temperature calculations and the Stefan Boltzmann constant, comes out at 250 degrees Fahrenheit inside the lunar lander. So they had to air condition it, but they couldn't air condition it because you can't dump the heat in a vacuum. So it had to be radiated away, which it would have been on the shadow side of the lunar lander. So how much was radiated away? 100% of what was hitting it once the temperature reached 250 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the problem. It's not engineering, it's just basic science. So where you've got this huge internal temperature of the lunar lander, as calculated scientifically, you're then being expected to believe that two astronauts spent on Apollo 11 22 hours, on Apollo 17 3 days, inside this temperature. It would cook the chicken in that time. So how did the astronauts survive? That's the question.
In that position, I would actually approach engineers that built the lunar rover, lunar module.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a fair point, Peter.
I'm not an engineer.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Maybe that was an unfair question. So
no, it wasn't an unfair question.
With every engineering question, you should approach an engineer that actually works on the project.
Talking of approaching NASA, I had a question that I directed to them. I said, if these spacesuits, which were used successfully on all the Apollo missions, protected the astronauts not only from the heat and cold variations, and it's approaching 500 degrees Fahrenheit, the variation in temperature, but also protected them from the lunar and galactic cosmic ray radiation levels, which we know exist in space, could these same spacesuits be used by technicians to go into Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, or now Fukushima, and help clear up the mess? Because obviously protected the astronauts from the radiation.
No, because the levels are completely different.
No, they're not that different.
Yes, they are completely different.
Right. What radiation is produced in Fukushima?
I haven't researched Fukushima. Okay.
Or Chernobyl?
From a layman's position, are we saying that we're arguing the point that there's different types of radiation in different areas?
And different amounts. It's completely different. It's not dangerously radioactive in space on a short exposure. I do know that.
So the misconception. Space is radioactive.
It is, but so is in your living room. So is in the hospital. So is in the dentist.
Okay, but
you've got background radiation everywhere.
The only thing is we do have the ozone layer to protect us from UV light and radiation.
Van Allen belts, not ozone layer.
Oh, sorry. The Van Allen belt was the issue. the contention being that if you did fly through it, you would be fried. Now, I have heard that it's a different type of radiation from, say, Chernobyl or Fukushima's. I don't know if you've got any knowledge on that at all, Peter.
And weaker too. Right, the early figures that came out, this is where the misconceptions are born. When the first satellite went up the guide count, Explorer 1, they didn't know how to calibrate it. They didn't know what kind of radiation to expect or to what level. So they calibrated just 100 counts or so a minute, because the background down here is about 20 or so. So it was launched, and it went off scale. And of course, when it was asked by the reporters, what did it read? As well, it went off scale. I don't know. It could be 101 counts a minute. It could be 1,000,001. So of course, the press then reported, space is dangerous. It's full of killer radiation and so on. But then, of course, correctly calibrated satellites went up recording it. It was nothing like that. It is dangerous with a long-term exposure, over a period of months or years. With a few hours that the Apollo spacecraft went through the worst part of Van Allen belts, it wasn't a problem. And the spacecraft is orientated in such a way that the approach to the radiation actually went through the bottom of the spacecraft, through the fuel tanks or electronics, before it actually reached the astronauts anyway. So it did have protection in several layers and several ways, which reduced the internal radiation down to a reasonable level.
What sort of protection did the flight have?
Well, all the metal surroundings. I mean, even alpha particles are stopped by paper. So it just depends on what kinds of radiation, different kinds.
Okay, so the dangerous type is that the gamma, the ones that need the lead aprons and the lead.
Gamma, yeah, but it's extremely weak in space. If you took a gamma ray shot of the sun, you'd hardly see it. Basically, it's a very weak form of radiation. Yeah, it is in intensity. Yeah, sure, it's dangerous. Yeah, if you had a machine up close giving you gamma rays, yeah, it'd give you cancer and so on. But the amount of gamma radiation that the sun's given off, as an example, is actually quite weak.
However, if I could just interject here, there is a video out on YouTube with a young engineer from NASA talking about the Orion mission, and he says, the Orion mission, when it's launched, has to navigate through its way through this dangerous belt of radiation once, and then once on the way back. We have to get through this radiation belt, which can harm humans, he says, and harm electronic equipment. We have to figure out a way to get through it. And everyone's going, hang on a minute, but we did it all those times back in the 60s and 70s, and it suddenly seems to be a big major issue today.
Yes, I don't know why that was actually stated. I've seen the report that you're referring to, but don't forget the Orion spacecraft is actually aimed at deeper space missions and for longer duration too. The Apollo mission's only 14 days. So
wasn't it President Obama who said, we'll send a man to the moon once we figured out how to get past the Van Allen radiation belt as well? I believe.
Obama wasn't a space scientist either.
But he would have been briefed, surely.
He would have been briefed, yeah. But things get twisted and so on. Even NASA announcements get twisted around by different people as it passes through different hands.
One thing that I find extremely curious is that with a straight face, there's one NASA scientist who says, we can't go back to the moon because we haven't got the technology that took us there. And there was this thing about them losing all the telemetric data to do with all the missions as well. That raises some serious alarm. I mean, they wouldn't have taped EastEnders over it. So the question is, where is it, and what are they talking about? With a serious face, saying we haven't got the technology to take us back to the moon. This is 1969 pre-ZX Spectrum.
Yeah.
I have a problem with that. And Peter, please don't think we're having a go at you, because it's not about that. We genuinely do want to hear kind of like from as much of a scientific or kind of like a spacefaring perspective as possible of somebody who could provide these kinds of answers, because I think Marcus has said, and I would love to believe as well, that we actually went to the moon, but it's these kinds of questions that are bringing up alarms, basically.
Yeah, we can go back to the moon at any time. There is a technology retention program. It's actually coordinated at Marshall Space Flight Center. So all the drawings and so on, all the rockets, Saturn V, the detail Lunar Rover, it's actually stored there on microfilm, and they digitized it now and so on. So it's still available, it's just a different format. But some of the telemetry was probably just taped over. It wasn't that important. Once the missions have been done, you're not actually learning that much from some of that telemetry, like heartbeats at a particular moment of the mission or something like that.
So do you think because I don't know the history of it actually. Was the space program in terms of sending a man back to the moon, was it ever formally cancelled, or because surely they would have saved it as something to refer to if they were going to do future missions? I think wasn't it that Nixon ran out of money or decided to cancel it? Am I right on that or not?
It's slightly cancelled. There's lots of reasons behind that. They felt their luck was running out because in every single Apollo mission something seriously went wrong with all of them. Apollo 13 was a classic example. But at some point, they was going to lose astronauts on the moon, on the way back, and so on. So they thought they'd cut it short. They was going to have Apollo 18, 19, and 20, and decided to cancel those and build the Skylab space station instead.
Right. Because one of the other reasons people have a difficult time in terms of the moon landings is I don't think Neil Armstrong or any astronaut had a single successful landing. I know that it was Earth's gravity, but practice landing of the lunar lander, not one of them was successful. In fact, he almost killed himself.
That's not true at all. Do you know how many flights there were before Neil Armstrong crashed that particular simulator?
Flying bedstead, as they called it, I think.
There's four.
Marcus, do you want to come in on this? Because
there's four of them as well.
Yeah, there were 690 flights before the crash.
Right. And how many crashed?
2.
About 690, exactly.
Yeah. Now.
So what about all the other successful test flights? Why aren't they quoted? You can still see 2 of them in museums across America.
Yeah, of course you can. Now, why wasn't Buzz Aldrin trained to land it? Why wasn't Al Bean trained to land it? It was only the commander who landed it.
Yeah.
In Buzz Aldrin's case, he couldn't land the thing. He wasn't trained to.
It takes 2 people to do that. So one can only do the landing, the other one does all the readings and so on. It's a coordinated effort between the 2. One person couldn't land the lunar module. You had to have 2 doing 2 different jobs. But
that's rather like flying on your holiday, and you hope that both the pilot and the co-pilot can land the plane if they need to.
Well, that's it.
But on Apollo, apparently only the pilot could land it.
But in the training simulations, there was only ever one pilot flying in those flying bedsteads at a time anyway. So it was a visual kind of data, presumably literally looking out on the landscape as they're bringing this thing to land in on Earth, that allowed them to land successfully. But they had no Buzz Aldrin with them giving out readings.
No, you wouldn't need. You're flying by instruments on those landers. You're not really on the moon, are you? So it's a different kind of situation.
Okay. With regard to surface temperatures and things like that, there was a photograph that was laid out on the surface of the moon by Charlie Duke of his family. I think he put it in a small plastic wallet. Now, obviously, it's very, very hot on the moon, and he took a picture of his family with a Hasselblad camera. Would it be true that picture would survive for thousands of years, or would it literally curl up after a few minutes or something?
No, it would curl up, it would fade, it would bleach from the sun, so it wouldn't last. No, he knew that. But it's
a symbolic.
It's an effort, isn't it? It's symbolic, yeah.
So he threw the picture on the floor, quickly snapped it, and maybe a few minutes later it curled up. Okay.
Well, not minutes, but it would have eventually. Yeah, sure. But he took an image of that on the moon. That's the whole point. That image would last forever. That's the important thing.
Yeah, the photograph of the photograph.
Photograph of the photograph.
Yeah.
And that was the point. It was symbolic for his family. Because he had to put up with a lot through his training and months away and so on. And risking his life too.
And are you familiar with a gentleman called Peter Hyatt? You're probably not, so we can explain who he is. We were discussing him in the last show. Peter Hyatt is a guy that works for the FBI, the American police, and he's appeared on a show called Rich Planet, an internet-based TV show with Richard D. Hall doing the research. And this guy focuses on people's speech analysis. So as they make a statement about something, particularly when they're being interviewed by police, he can work out by using the pronouns, the adjectives, and the phrasing of what they're saying. Even if they're lying, he can work out exactly what they're lying about, and they're not being truthful about situations, and he can work it out just by working out their phraseology and stuff like that. He's not even looking at their body language. And he did some analysis of the Madeleine McCann case, of footage of the McCann family talking about how their daughter was supposedly kidnapped, and he came to the conclusion that they weren't actually kidnapped at all, that Madeleine is actually dead and they were somehow involved in that. So this Peter Hyatt was actually asked to analyse an interview with Neil Armstrong and Patrick Moore from 1971, something like that, where he's talking about his experiences on the moon, and he came to the conclusion that, well, there's 4 conclusions. 1, that he was lying. 2, that he always talks like that to his wife, like in a very robotic fashion, which seemed very unlikely. 3, that he's concealing something of national importance or security. And 4th was non-conclusive. I can't remember if that's the exact way, but that's just from memory. So basically, it kind of throws up a lot of questions about the Apollo mission as far as Neil Armstrong's concerned anyway. I mean, Marcus, you've seen that, haven't you?
Yeah, yes, I've seen that program. I've watched it all the way through. He analyzes Neil Armstrong's speech in various categories, and also Buzz Aldrin, and comes to the conclusion that basically they're concealing something. He doesn't say what, because I don't think anybody can say what they were concealing if they were, but they don't appear to be people who have achieved one of the great scientific and political events of the 20th century, or even all time. They appear almost embarrassed about it. I mean, the famous sequence of the Apollo 11 press conference held after they got out of their quarantine, which was about 3 weeks, to make sure they didn't get any nasty germs from the moon, presumably. They look rather embarrassed to be in front of the world's press. Now, if you've been selected as an astronaut to conduct one of NASA's prime missions, which cost a fortune in 1969 terms, don't you think you should be a little bit more enthusiastic about what you've done on behalf of the American people and the 400,000 people who worked on the program? I think you should. What they look like are naughty schoolboys caught smoking behind the bike sheds.
we'll let Peter come in on this one. Peter,
Right, the astronauts are not the average human being. Have you met any of the Apollo astronauts?
Yes, I have.
Talked to them at length.
Yes,
A lot of them are very few words, straight to the point. They didn't get into that career for the charisma, the fame, none of that. They got in there for this sense of achievement. And
but they don't
behave differently to most people.
No, this is a standard explanation trotted out every time somebody questions the integrity of the astronauts. I'm not questioning the integrity of the astronauts. They are brave men.
Yeah, of course they are. They risk their lives.
They're extremely brave men. They had the right stuff, but they were also all military. They were under orders
there's
for
one
national security.
There's one exception there.
Harrison Smith. Yeah, he was a geologist who went on to become a senator.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have been allowed on the astronaut program without taking the oaths of secrecy that all the others did. They wouldn't have agreed to accept him on the program.
I've even signed the Official Secrets Act, and I've never been in the military, so yeah.
No, that's right. I've signed it, and I was just a postman. So it doesn't mean anything. That's meaningless.
Peter, bringing it back down to earth, pardon the pun intended. Why is it that Neil Armstrong only ever gave 2 interviews and spent the rest of his life as a recluse on a farm, never really talking about?
He wasn't a recluse. He was a lecturer. He was a lecturer in aviation.
Wasn't one of his phrases that he said to the college people something along the lines of revealing truth's protective layers? What was that all about?
I've got no idea.
That was the press conference.
I think it's a bit unfair because you've obviously prepped all this. I haven't got a clue what questions you're going to come out with.
Yeah.
If I knew in advance, I could go and research all this and give you the correct answers.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough.
I was given 24 hours notice to do this. And you're both prepared and got all sorts of things already sorted out and images you studied and so on. Thousands of images were taken. I can't look at, imagine what it is you're looking at and so on,
Okay, let me kind of rephrase it. From a common sense point of view, without needing to research it or without needing to kind of look into the exact details of it. Why would somebody that went to the moon, such a monumental experience, something that is kind of pivotal, the number one thing that mankind could ever do would be to walk on the moon? Why, why did he kind of? Some people say he was a recluse. You're saying he wasn't, and he was.
No, he wasn't a recluse. He just hated public attention. It wasn't his career. Buzz Aldrin changed in time and made it his new career, but Neil Armstrong didn't want anything to do with it. He had words with Charles Lindbergh about this, and he gave him advice, and he took it because he did exactly the same thing. He didn't want fame. He didn't want to spend hours and hours signing autographs and taking pictures, all these selfies you get these days. He was tired of it. He was a pilot. That was it. That was his career, and that's what he wanted to do. So he went back into that in teaching aviation after his career in NASA. He couldn't top. He wasn't going to go back to the moon again. He couldn't top it. There's no point in staying there. So he started up a new career in a different direction.
So when the presumably you're aware of the footage of the press conference where Patrick Moore was asking questions to three of them, and Patrick Moore said, "What do you remember about the stars?" And they looked to each other and said, "I don't remember seeing any stars. Did you?"
No.
I mean, what do
nor would you. You're there. Were they on the moon during the lunar night or the lunar day?
I don't know.
the lunar day, the sun was up in the sky. Okay, so you've got your sun up there in your eyes. You've got the bright daylight shining onto the moon's surface. Under those conditions, you cannot look in the sky instantly and see stars. Neil and Buzz only had 2 hours on the surface or so. It wasn't in their schedule to stare up at the stars to see if they could see them or not. There was unveiling all the equipment. They had a schedule, a photographic schedule. They had a phone call from the president, Nixon, and all this in just a couple of hours. And that was it. It was off. But of course, later missions had a lot more time. They had 2 to 3 days.
Just one point on that, Peter. Yes, they had 2 hours on the lunar surface, but they spent 21 hours on the moon in their lander. And Mike Collins spent all that time orbiting the moon. Half of the time he just spent in shadow of the moon. He could have had plenty of time to look out the window and say, "Wow, look at that incredible vista we can see." Because he'd be in the shadow of the moon, therefore the stars would not be blocked out by any sunlight.
Correct.
So
they used stars for navigation as well.
Yes, they did. So they could see stars on the lunar surface. So
not lunar surface. You didn't need them on the lunar surface. You need them up there when you're actually introductory to the moon and back. That's when you take your readings, your star readings. You don't take them on the moon.
The slight alarm bells that ring for me is, for instance, as I was talking to you, Peter, before the show, my brother actually went to South Africa a few years ago, and he was in an area that was completely black, completely dark at night. There was no light pollution, and he was just in absolute awe of the stars. He said it was amazing. You could see the Milky Way, all the galaxies. It was just like nothing like what you get in a normal day or night in Britain or, a built-up area. And Yuri Gagarin apparently said similar when he said one of the things that struck him when he was out in space, the stars were everywhere. Stars were above me, stars below me, stars all around me. So it obviously made a big impact on my brother. It made a big impact on Yuri Gagarin. I'm wondering why it didn't make a big impact on any of the Apollo astronauts.
Right, it did on some of them. They did have more time on the later missions to see the stars, because you've got to turn your back to the sun, you've got to shield your eyes from the lunar surface, stand there for about 2 minutes and get dark adapted, then you'll begin to see stars, just like you would on Earth. If you stand underneath a 2 kilowatt lights on your back garden, try and see the stars, you won't. You've got to shield your eyes and get dark adapted too. So if you come out with a really bright room straight out in the garden, you might see 2 or 3 stars. That's it.
Oh, cool.
Stay there for a quarter of an hour, then you can see the Milky Way and everything else if it's dark enough.
True, right. But surely they during the space flight, surely they would be looking out of the windows and seeing the awesome sights.
Yes, you would, on the night side of the Earth, if possible, and if they got time to do it. Yuri Gagarin, the spacecraft was entirely robotic. He had nothing to do once he actually got into orbit. So he had more time to do those sort of observations, and so on. So it's different for every case. The later astronauts did see the stars because they had more time to get dark adapted and have a look. There's nothing scientific about it. It wasn't on their schedule to stare up at the stars for 2 minutes if you can see them. It wasn't exactly
true, but it would be something, because it wasn't. Yes, it was a scientific mission, but it was also a PR mission as well. It was also about the phone calls to the president and talking to their family and that kind of thing. So there was I suppose you could call it a human aspect as well as the scientific aspect.
Yeah, sure.
And I would have thought, if I was an astronaut and I saw absolutely stunning views, I would have said, "Hey guys, you should see out of our window at the moment. It's amazing."
Well, they did do that, of course, with the Earth and the Moon itself. So it was a lot easier to see. You don't have to wait to get dark adapted and so on. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah.
Right. Interesting. There's one problem with the Gagarin statement of what he saw. He didn't have a porthole to look through.
He did. He had a window.
No, he didn't. Not on that particular craft. He didn't. And he was saying things that he was seeing, allegedly, when he wasn't in a position to see them.
So you think Gagarin's flight was fake as well?
Yes, I do. And I can prove it.
We'll have to do a Russian space.
Well, of course it was. Look. Okay. Have you heard of Vladimir Ilyushin, Peter?
Vladimir Komarov, but not Ilyushin.
Vladimir Ilyushin. He was the son of the aircraft designer, famous Soviet aircraft designer in the 1960s. There are still Ilyushin planes today. It's a big company today, but the original founder of the company, his son, Vladimir Ilyushin, was probably the Soviet Union's top test pilot and certainly the best known flyer at the time. He was supposedly the first cosmonaut, and the flight took off a week before Gagarin's flight. The trouble is, Ilyushin's flight landed in China. The retro rockets didn't fire properly. He was very badly injured. He was returned to the Soviet Union, as agreed between China and the Soviet Union, about 6 months later, where he resumed his career eventually in the Soviet Air Force. Gagarin was the PR image, the desperate scramble to get somebody up into space. The information about Gagarin's flight comes from the two Italian brothers in Turin recording the Soviet transmissions from their spacecraft as it overflew Italy. There's enough information to demonstrate the Soviet Union was hiding a great deal of problems with their space program. They only announced the successes. They didn't announce the problems.
Yeah.
So, Gagarin wasn't the first. He wasn't the second. He wasn't even the third. He was the first to land successfully. But he didn't even land in his spacecraft. He parachuted out of it.
Yeah, that's correct.
Which means that he technically didn't complete his flight, according to the international aviation rules for first flights. You have to complete your flight in the craft in which you took off. He didn't. Therefore, he wasn't the first man. So you've got all these anomalies. History is now being not rewritten so much as being investigated correctly, because the information is now coming out of the Soviet Union, or out of Russia, the Russian Federation, of what was occurring during the Soviet Union. And they're as embarrassed about it as everybody is rather excited to hear about it over in the West. The Soviet Union was in a desperate race to survive as a country. They weren't going to make a fuss about America capering around on the moon and making some strange statements. They had far more important things to get on with.
And on that note, Neil, how are we doing on time?
We have to close the show, I'm afraid, gentlemen. It's actually been fascinating. I mean, we could go on for hours and hours and hours. We'll probably never reach a conclusion. But it's obviously going into very interesting territory, even beyond the Apollo things, because it looks like the Russians are up to no good as well. Very interesting.
Just go back to the moon. That's all it takes. Photograph the Apollo landing sites. I'll shut up, go away and do something more interesting.
But that's been done.
No, it hasn't.
It hasn't been done. It's been done by two individual satellites.
How many?
Two individual satellites.
Which ones?
Prospero.
Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, is it? Or something?
LRO, that's it.
Yeah.
The LRO, Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. You believe that is evidence sufficient to prove that Apollo landed on the moon?
That's only a tiny part of it, but yeah.
I've heard of Photoshop too.
We can all do that. We can all take a piece of history, tear it apart, say it's fake.
I would say that if there are government satellites who are able to zoom into a newspaper, why are we seeing tiny images from those satellites that went to the moon? I mean, they could give us really high definition, high quality.
Not from the Earth's orbit, they can't.
No, this is lunar orbit.
Even the Hubble can't do it.
No, come on, look, 25 kilometers orbit above the lunar surface. We're talking a photograph from 25 kilometers away.
Yeah, that can be recorded.
No, that's where the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was flying. It was orbiting at 30 kilometers. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was orbiting at 30 kilometers, and all they can take is a couple of little pixels. I don't believe it.
Pixels, just a lot of detail. We actually see the actual tracks of the astronauts' footprints themselves.
Oh, come on.
Place to another.
Those tracks, when you look at them, are as wide as the lander. What were they, giants or something? Just look at the picture.
I think we're going to have to go into another. We're going to have to go into another episode. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Gentlemen, just very quickly, Peter, could you give us your any books or any web links or anything you'd like people to look into at all?
I've got astronomyroadshow.com is my business, and we looked at in 25 years. And I've got a book out, The Great Moon Landing Hoax, or Was It? And it's got all the correct details on there of all the most common points conspiracy people support. You had mentioned today about why those stars in the pictures, it's been going on about for years. It's such a simple thing to explain, and yet no one accepts the correct answer.
I do. I accept the correct answer on that, Peter.
Why do all the conspiracy supporters keep bashing on about why there are no stars in pictures when it's a very simple photographic argument of why?
Because they're not properly educated, like me. They don't understand what's going on. That argument about no stars in the sky and flapping flags and stunning, that's all complete nonsense. Absolute rubbish. Of course the flag wasn't flapping on the moon.
It was flapping on the moon.
Yes, only when somebody was touching.
Exactly. No, even when you let go, it will carry on flapping.
Yes, it would.
Marcus. Because unfortunately we really do have to wrap it up. Marcus, what's your website and what's your books that you refute these things that people can get hold of?
Okay, go to nexusmagazine.com if you want to communicate with me. If you want to get in touch with me, nexusmagazine.com. If you want a full week of research into what all this is about by people who've spent a considerable number of years doing it, go to aulis.com. That's AULIS.com. And also moonfaker.com. That's the website for Jarrah White, where you'll get lots and lots of films you can look at. You don't have to read anything, you can just watch the films, where he basically examines many of the Apollo deceptions that have been going on.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you. I'm glad that this is civil. I know you guys are absolute loggerheads. We
expected that though, yeah.
But doing it in a civil way and thrashing through the things, I think, is the way to go. I found it absolutely fascinating. Neil, I'm sure you found it fascinating as well.
Absolutely, and we barely touched. We barely gone through any of the arguments. We have only just, literally, as I said before, scratched the lunar surface on this one. So I'd like to say thank you very much for Peter for joining us in part 2, and also for Marcus Allen of Nexus Magazine for joining us in both shows. And you can listen to part 1 of that. That's on Stitcher, Podbean and iTunes. And you can listen to this show again on any of those platforms if you want to listen to them back to back. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So thank you very much, one and all, for joining us on the Paranormal Peep Show, talking about the Apollo lunar missions. And good night to all.
I would also say to people, please do view both sides. Listeners to this would probably have a fixed view of either anti or pro moon landings. Please view both sides and then make up your own minds. I think that's kind of like the whole point of this show. Thanks for listening, guys, and we'll see you for the next Paranormal Peep Show.
Okay.
And thanks to our guests.
Good night all. Thank you very much indeed.
Good night.